Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Herbert Hoover, and the focus is ideology, politics, and more relief. The year is 1919. Hoover is 45 years old, and he is exhausted. He spent the last 5 years in this unprecedented relief effort that he was leading over in Europe during the war, came back to California, and he wanted a break. He told everyone, don't bother me for a month. I'm spending time just with family, small group of friends. I'm going fishing a lot, and he did all that. But when he came up for air, Herbert Hoover was in big demand. People wanted to know his thoughts on all kinds of topics, and he pretty much didn't say no very much. Over the next 15 months, he gave 46 speeches, wrote 28 magazine articles. He appeared in front of 9 different congressional committees, usually talking about humanitarian causes and the situation in Europe. And he wrote a book. This was his first non-engineering book, and he called it American Individualism. It's one of the first real insights into the ideology of Herbert Hoover, and it wasn't just political ideology. It was also cultural and social. It really gives real insights into the mindset that Hoover would have really for the rest of his career, which would increasingly, of course, be in politics. He said in this book that, and from it all, I emerge as an individualist, an unashamed individualist. But let me say also that I am an American individualist, for America has been steadily developing the ideals that constitute progressive individualism. And American individualism to Herbert Hoover was unique in all the world. Our individualism differs from all others because it embraces these great ideals that while we build our society upon the attainment of the individual, we shall safeguard to every individual an equality of opportunity to take that position in the community to which his intelligence, character, ability, and ambition entitle him. In other words, that unique thing called the American dream. Now, Hoover, of course, had his Quaker roots, his personal experience. He said, look, this was not a zero-sum game. The American dream was available to all, and it had an opportunity to lift all boats to rise. Part of this was a responsibility of service to the community, part of this whole prospect of American individualism. There's developing in our people a new valuation of individuals and of groups and of nations, he wrote. It is a rising vision of service. Indeed, if I were to select the social force that above all others has advanced sharply during these past years of suffering, it is that of service. Service to those with whom we come in contact, service to the nation, service to the world itself. Hoover published this book, American Individualism, around the time of the 1920 presidential election, which was a wide open contest. Candidates for both parties were going to be new to this race, and people thought maybe Herbert Hoover should be a candidate. Well, folks didn't even know what political party Herbert Hoover belonged to. In the 1918 midterms, he actually supported the Democrats because he thought it was important for the country to rally around the current president at time of war. But he'd also been a member of the Republican Club of New York since 1909. Now, of all people, one of his supporters was a Democrat, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt. Got to know Hoover at the Paris Peace Talks recently, and he said at the time, I had some nice talks with Herbert Hoover before he went west for Christmas. He certainly is a wonder, and I wish we could make him President of the United States. There could not be a better one. My, how sentiments would change over time. And Herbert Hoover wasn't even sure he wanted political office. He made the point that I do not believe that I have the mental attitude or the politician's manner. Above all, I am too sensitive to political mud. But people still wanted to enter Hoover into the primaries in this race. In fact, in Michigan, he was entered into both the Democratic and Republican primaries. He won the Democratic primary. He finished third in the Republican primary. Finally, though, he made his intent clear. When the California primary, his home state, came up, he agreed to enter into the Republican side of things, going up against one of the Republican frontrunners so far, Hiram Johnson. Now, Johnson won the primary, but Hoover had a strong second. Perhaps, maybe if there's a impasse at the convention, maybe a dark horse, maybe it could be Herbert Hoover. Because going into that convention, there were 3 clear favorites. It was Johnson, General Leonard Wood, and Governor Frank Lowden of Illinois, when the conventioneers all came to Chicago in June for their meeting, but they were in a deadlock. Sure enough, a dark horse was going to have to emerge, but it wasn't Herbert Hoover. He got some votes, but he topped out at 9.5 votes, so not very many. Eventually, the delegates went with Ohio Senator Warren Harding. Harding as the standard bearer, with Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge as the VP nominee. Now, Harding opted for a front porch campaign from his hometown of Marion, Ohio, and Herbert Hoover was one of many who made the trip to Marion to talk to the candidate, maybe give some advice, also be considered possibly for a cabinet position. This led to a landslide decision for the American people. Harding's message of a return to normalcy resonated. He won the election easily, and now he had some decisions to make. Now, Warren Harding had been a newspaper publisher of a small-town newspaper for most of his career. He did spend the last 6 years in his one term in the United States Senate, but now he's president-elect of the United States. He's being pulled in all kinds of directions. To form his cabinet, he really went with two groups. One you could call the cronies, the other you could call, or at least he called, the best minds. For the cronies, you had people like Harry Daugherty as Attorney General. Senator Albert Fall went to the Interior Department. But for the best minds, well, you had Charles Evans Hughes, the former Supreme Court Justice, Secretary of State now for Harding. Andrew Mellon, the millionaire banker from Pittsburgh that went to the Treasury Department, and Herbert Hoover was offered either initially Interior or Commerce. He settled upon Commerce, but this was not a slam dunk nomination. There were Republicans who were weary of Hoover. They thought, well, he had just supported Democrats in a recent election. He's pretty independent. Do we really want him in this cabinet? Well, Warren Harding wasn't taking no for an answer. He knew that the senators wanted Mellon at Treasury, and he basically said it's Mellon and Hoover or no Mellon, and the senators said fine. They confirmed them all. Now, the Commerce Department was still relatively new as a standalone cabinet agency. Hoover's just the third secretary in the history of that agency, and it was kind of a backwater, mostly a collection of data is what the Commerce Department did. Officially, they were charged to foster, promote, and develop the foreign and domestic commerce, the mining, manufacturing, shipping, and fishing industries, and the transportation facilities of the United States. But Hoover was out to expand this mission quite a bit. He frankly had his hand in almost all domestic policies. Very aggressive and a very impactful Secretary of Commerce. But before he could do most of that, he had a couple things to do. First, he had to settle in Washington, D.C. He never lived there before. He and Lou found a home on S Street. It happened to be just 3 doors down from where former President Woodrow Wilson and his wife Edith had just moved in as well. But before he could really get focused on the domestic issues, there was another international crisis. More food relief was needed. This is 1921, and Russia was starving. The Russians had gone through the Russian Revolution, then they had 3 years of civil war. The Bolsheviks in charge had imposed farm collectivization, which wasn't really working, and now they had 2 years of massive droughts. The Bolsheviks were under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, and he was realizing, look, I can't feed this nation, I might lose control of the country. And so a little bit out of desperation, they made an appeal to the Americans for help. And President Warren Harding knew that only meant one person, Herbert Hoover, based on his recent experience during World War I. Now, Hoover was no fan of the communists. He never would be, but he was always willing to put politics aside in order to save innocent lives in conditions just like this. But he had a couple of conditions before he would agree. First, the Russians had to release 7 American political prisoners. The group that under Hoover would need unrestricted access in Russia anywhere they wanted to go, they needed permission to do so. They also wanted complete authority to allocate food based on need, not based on internal Russian politics. And by the way, the Russians needed to help pay for this. They had $11 million in gold from the Tsar days. That had to be contributed to this effort. Really, the Russians had no choice. They agreed to these terms. In fact, Lenin was confident in the relationship with Hoover and the Americans. He said, Hoover is a real plus. Agreements and concessions with the Americans are super important to us. With Hoover, we have something worthwhile. Hoover turned to Colonel William Haskell to lead the effort in Russia. He had been on the ground in Armenia during the recent relief efforts over in Europe, and now he got on the ground and found the situation dire in Russia. He wrote a note back to Hoover that said death was only a few months away for millions of people. And there were shocking things that they found. Dogs and cats were gone. They'd all been eaten. Bark off trees, eaten. There was even instances of cannibalism as the last stand before imminent death for some of these Russians. This is what the Americans had walked into. Now, the American people once again rallied to Hoover and the cause. They put forward in voluntary charity contributions. 50 of the $80 million that Hoover used in this effort came from the American people. His ship started arriving within a couple of weeks. The Soviets were not easy to deal with in this. Frankly, they didn't trust the Americans. They were disruptive of the effort sometimes, and Hoover like he had to do in Europe, basically threatened to leave. Look, if you don't abide by the rules that we said, we're just going to stop delivering food. And Lenin and the leadership always caved in to whatever Hoover's demands were when this kind of stuff came up. Now, the spring harvest finally came in Russia. The drought was over. They were able to wind down their efforts, but this was, frankly, another miracle on behalf of Herbert Hoover and the American people. 150 shipments of food, 700 tons of commodities helped feed 18 million Russians. A writer by the name of Maxim Gorki wrote Hoover a note. In all the history of human suffering, I know of no accomplishment which in terms of magnitude and generosity can be compared to the relief that you have actually accomplished. Your help will be inscribed in history as a unique, gigantic accomplishment worthy of the greatest glory and will long remain in the memory of millions of Russians whom you saved from death. Even the leadership of the Russians also got in, and at the very end, they gave a personal thanks to Hoover, to Haskell, and wrote that all the people inhabiting the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics never will forget the aid rendered to them by the American people through the agency of the American Relief Administration, holding it to be a pledge of the future friendship of the two nations. Now, of course, that last line turned out to be a bit of a bust. In fact, during the Cold War, a couple of decades later, the Russians would completely repudiate this entire effort. They would paint Hoover and the Americans as in a negative light, imperialistic perspective, but none of that in time could ever take away from the nearly miraculous service that Hoover provided as part of being the great humanitarian. That's Herbert Hoover, Ideology, Politics, and More Relief from the life of Herbert Hoover. For the more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.